Well, thanks, everybody. My name is Karen Gutman. I'm a member of the National Advisory Council for IGS, and I'm very pleased to see you all here. We're all very proud supporters of this organization and this forum, and for those of you who are here and want to become supporters, we hope you will, so that these forums can continue every 4 years. I'm also a partner with the firm of Remcho, Johansson, and Purcell, and we are co-sponsoring this luncheon today with our Republican counterparts at Nielsen, Merksimer, Parinello, Gross, and Leone. Our two firms have been involved in every gubernatorial election race for at least as long as IGS has been holding these forums, and I suspect longer. And we've always been on the opposite side, not surprisingly. But we didn't have any trouble coming to a very quick agreement on who we wanted to ask to be the luncheon speaker.
You bill less.
We do bill less than they do. Bill Lockyer, besides being one of our favorite Cal graduates, is really the right person to do the keynote luncheon speech today. As you know, Bill's state treasurer now and has been since 2006. And before that, he served as our Attorney General and had the good fortune of being in the legislature before term limits. So being able to spend 25 years there and become a president of the Senate before he left. But he hasn't yet run for governor. Although every Democratic primary, I think, doesn't really get underway until those two famous questions are answered: is Diane running and is Bill running? And although Bill hasn't thrown his hat into the race yet, he hasn't shied away from expressing his views about those who have run and those who have gotten into the office. And as his campaign ad from this summer demonstrated, and it was one of my favorites, Bill's not afraid to call both Democrats and Republicans to task, which is something that the voters seem to want to hear this year, because Bill received more votes in this November election than any other candidate who's running in a November election in the country. And that's particularly astonishing when you realize that there was an 8% drop-off from governor to treasurer's race, and yet he still received more votes than the candidates for governor. Some of you may remember Bill's last appearance at an IGS gubernatorial post-election forum. It was memorable. I don't think he's going to announce today that he voted for Meg Whitman. It would be nice if he could tell us whether Arnold Schwarzenegger voted for Meg Whitman, although I suppose the silence speaks volumes on that one. But I don't have any doubt that Bill's going to say something memorable that we'll all be thinking about in the weeks to come. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the Honorable Bill Lockyer.
Thanks for refreshing people's memory about 6 years ago. I always have to tell people, because I only saw half the story subsequently, which was I was strongly opposed to the recall of Gray Davis, and like many voters was hopeful, and like most voters was disappointed. But anyhow, I'm going to talk about this chart in a moment, but it'll take me a minute to get there, but I want you to kind of have a chance to have your own. You know, several years ago, Tom Frank wrote a book titled What's Wrong with Kansas? And it was his attempt to explain from an admittedly liberal perspective the American heartland's attraction to conservatism. After this last year's elections, I wouldn't be surprised if a conservative writer now penned a book entitled What's the Matter with California? In an attempt to explain how and why the Republican tidal wave broke at the California border. And it's a question worthy of explanation. I know you've had considerable discussion about those sorts of things, and sort of tell you how I think about it. And why were the California results somewhat unique? As you know, Democratic sweep of every state constitutional office, not a single loss of a congressional or Senate seat held by Democrats, and a pickup of one seat in the state assembly by Democrats. Well, my explanation starts with one perhaps counterintuitive fact. The California results were not the result of some hyped up turnout base or a depressed Republican turnout. An examination of the actual election results, as opposed to the exit polls or post-election polling, show that the 2010 turnout in every demographic group was within a percentage or two of the 2006 turnout, with some exceptions. So in 2010, the voters were the people that were there in 2006. One exception that's interesting is the 18 to 24-year-old voters, and you'll see this chart compares 06 and 10, the various demographic groups and so on, to get a sense of what the differences were. So with respect to those young voters, they turned out at 6.4% percentage higher than in 06. I guess there are some that think that they were motivated by a proposition on the ballot. Don't know. The 25 to 34-year-old voters improved turnout by 3.6%. Republicans increased their turnout by 3.6%, declined to state by 3.4%. Exit polls that we've seen so far in other states do show varying degrees of a higher turnout among Republican base voters, along with some depressed numbers of the Democratic base. But in California, we simply had a decent turnout among all voters. So if a turnout doesn't explain California's Democratic exceptionalism, what does? I believe California has a structural firewall that protected Democrats against any Republican shellacking, despite all of the money spent on that side. Democrats continue to win substantial majorities of women, Latinos, African Americans, Asians, younger voters, gay and lesbian voters, coastal voters, liberals, college-educated voters. When you combine that coalition with the majority of moderate and decline to state voters who express their preference for Democratic candidates in almost every election, you have to ask, who the hell's left to vote for the Republicans? Simply answered, Republicans are the party of older white voters from inland California, a base too small to win in 21st century California. Those demographics have been with us for 20 years and so show no sign of changing. This electoral reality deeply impacts how we govern in California. The shrinking Republican Party is so dominated by conservative voters that competitive Republican primaries damage their nominees who have to work through the litmus test minefield of taxes, immigration, abortion, gay rights, environment, and of course not to forget the John and Ken primary test. I was on John and Ken last night. It's always a wonderful experience. Remember, the most successful Republican candidate in recent years was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who never ran in a competitive Republican primary. For Democrats, the challenge is not how we put together a successful campaign coalition, but how we govern successfully. And for Democrats at this moment in history, the challenge of governing is how do we restore fiscal reality to our state budget and at the same time grow our state's economy. Democrats run for public office because we believe government should play an active role in improving the lives of its citizens. Very few Democrats run for office because they want to shrink the size of government. In 2011 and beyond, Democrats will have to defer their historic ideological mission for another time and accept the responsibility of cutting government spending now. The duty will inevitably put a Democratic governor, Democratic constitutional officers, and most especially Democratic legislators at odds with some of the traditional Democratic constituencies and interest groups. And it's my view that the elected officials can't shrink from that responsibility. California voters overwhelmingly have chosen Democrats to lead them out of this economic crisis. And if we fail, the political consequences in future elections could be profound. Governor Brown has opened the debate by coming forward with an honest budget based on real numbers, free of phony accounting gimmicks. Its basic premise is that half of the answer to erasing the deficit should come from cuts in spending and half should come by extending taxes that are scheduled to expire. A formula, by the way, that was also Governor Pete Wilson's, faced with similar problems. Pete now views it as the worst, well, one of the worst things he ever did. This is, it seems to me, both sound policy and good politics. As political leaders and as voters, if we do not support and follow through with this particular path and close our budget deficits, the consequences will be profound. At some point, I hope there'll be a published proposal of an all-cut budget so people can actually see what it looks like. I have no enthusiasm for closing the public schools an additional 6 weeks of the school year. That's one of many, and that might be the low end of how much you have to shut them. If you did an across-the-board 31% cut in all forms of spending. That's assuming you can even do Medi-Cal with MOEs and other things. It's assuming that you can reduce prison sentences and discharge a lot of either old or short-term inmates and other things that would not be easy to avoid deeper cuts in K-14. Well, our inability to create bipartisan compromises in the state budget has resulted in this endless shell game that's mired California in a persistent and ever-growing budget deficit. Unfortunately, too often, the expedient has trumped the prudent. Democrats must prove that they're willing to make substantial cuts in government spending to have credibility in this debate with voters and with Republican colleagues. The fact is that voters are likely to again reject the governor's call to extend expiring taxes unless they see real budget cuts passed by the legislature. I hope Republicans will begin to participate fully in the governing of California, and Democrats should welcome their participation. If Republicans fail in their responsibility, they will continue to be a shrinking minority party. They must negotiate with the governor and Democratic colleagues in good faith and take the litmus tests off the table. That would begin to make the Republican Party relevant to the future of California. And to my Republican friends, I ask this simple question. What good has all the political posturing done for the Republican Party when you can't make progress in California during a national Republican landslide? It's time to try a new approach. When Grover Norquist, who, by the way, I think has a very substantial six-figure income. But anyhow, when Grover Norquist, a professional anti-tax activist based in Washington, D.C., demands that every California Republican legislator sign a no-tax pledge, that even a pledge that he insists denying people the right to vote on the path forward, we really are in the twilight zone. If Republicans are hostages to their litmus test politics, they won't be at the table that works out the budget fix. Republican voices and ideas will not be a part of the solution. Let me mention also this difficulty. Democrats can't expect Republicans to commit political suicide in order to pass a budget. That's why Democrats must be prepared to negotiate with Republicans on spending cuts that last at least as long as the tax hike extensions. Should either party come out of the budget negotiations declaring victory, California will be the loser. Democrats and Republicans can choose another way. We can turn California around. It was just 50 weeks. You know, I loved listening to the numerous John Kennedy speeches that we saw again 50 years and so on. In his inaugural address, of course, he said, in a different context, but it still applied, united, there is little we cannot do. divided, there is little we can do. I think that's true of Sacramento as well, and I welcome any questions or comments from you. Thanks for the chance to listen.
Questions, anybody? We'll be coming around with the microphones. We'll start here. You? No. Sorry.
Hey, Bill, the New York Times had a piece yesterday about there's some under the radar activity on Capitol Hill about preparing states for bankruptcy. And I know you've said that's an impossibility, but what do you know about that, and how does it affect California?
Yeah, this is why I was called by Ken and John, because I put out a statement saying no state has asked for it, no state wants it. It's based on a fiction that states either need or want to or will consider going into bankruptcy. And this was a Newt Gingrich proposal, and Newt's philosophy somewhat consistently in the last several years, which sort of paralleled mine when I was sitting in Sproul Hall some decades ago as part of the free speech movement, is you got to burn the house down and rebuild. And so it's sort of it's kind of Newt's view of the world these days, and here's the latest. So let's crash the states, and then we'll think about what we'll have after. I'm the banker for the state, and so my reaction to the preposterous suggestion is to worry about the millions of people who have bought bonds, because it depresses the value unnecessarily of their property. And so for somebody who claims to be sensitive about property rights, it turns out I'm the spokesman saying don't injure these people who are bondholders and their property rights unnecessarily. Secondly, it increases the cost of borrowing for state and localities. Now, people talk about debt service and how much is good or bad or whatever in the federal debt that's paying operational expenses. But for us, I do a lot of borrowing, like $10 billion or so a year, just to pay next month's bills. It's not long-term debt. It's just cash management, because there are times of the year when the money is abundant, in April 15th, and times when it's in July, slow. And so we borrow in order to bridge those gaps. Well, those kinds of worries in the investment community substantially increase the borrowing costs of short and long-term debt. So taxpayers wind up paying more. Irresponsible. And third, as someone who thought that Newt and others were sensitive about states' rights issues, to have the federal government change the law to compel states to waive their sovereign rights and go to federal bankruptcy court is abridgment of states' rights that was written in 1787, and I don't think should lightly be done. So there are three conservative reasons why it's a bad idea, and an unnecessary one. But anyhow, well, yes.
Go ahead.
Do you foresee in this difficult budget period where Democrats are so much in control that there will be an expansion of the tax base by beginning to tax the large markets that are currently off the tax board, such as gambling, such as marijuana? There are many, many other such examples.
Well, I don't think those would have been the first two I'd put on the list if I were contemplating expanding the tax base. There are, of course, there's a huge underground economy that enforcement actions might bring in monies owed. But separate from that, the traditional argument is whether there ought to be taxes on services, not just income or property. And that's an ongoing debate, which I suspect someday there'll be some broadening of the sales tax base to pick up some services. I don't know which ones and when or in what context that will happen. The most likely circumstance would be one where you broaden the base and lower the amount so that it nets out as fairer and smarter. One of the reasons when we talk about California, I heard the tax comments earlier, and of course you recognize that in aggregate taxes paid per capita, we're about 14th in the country. And we hear people that like to say, well, we have this high rate of this sort and high rate of that sort. Yes, and it's usually because the base is narrower. And so to the extent that you broaden the base, you can bring the rates down, and at least the optics or perhaps some unfairness, unfair progressivity is addressed. Please. Or,
No, don't go.
okay.
With Proposition 13 and the inability for us to have any revenue come, or any substantive revenue come from property tax, and with sales tax being one of the only two pillars we can really rely on, and the way that that causes the fiscalization of land use within counties and cities, do you ever see, I'm thinking of Fresno and all those strip malls, do you ever see, without any re-reliance on other taxable sales like services or a reinstitution of property tax, fiscalization of land use, and going away, and a re-realization of sustainable zoning laws?
Yeah, I'm sorry you're asking me all these policy things, because I'm just T-bill. I'm the banker dude, so. And this is fiscal in a sense, but first of all, maybe the relevant thoughts from me are this. I like to see the empirical evidence, and I've heard the argument made regularly about fiscalization of land use, and I do see it on occasion where it's desirable to have a auto mall or a big box store or so on. I'm not sure how much acreage is consumed that way that's imprudent or unwise, and so I'd like to see some more empirical analysis and less theory about it. I'm the one that used to regularly say to colleagues, the plural of anecdote is not evidence, and could we do a little more work on defining our policy options with some facts? It never worked then or now. But the other thought I have is I think we're at or near the ceiling of our aggregate tax capacity in the state of California, state and local, so that those that would like to spend more are going to have to realize we aren't going to. And it's not just a function of the fact that you need a 2/3 votes and the Republicans aren't going to agree. It's just the amount that government can take to the public sector and the natural constraints and what voters are willing to pay for, particularly in a context of when you ask the question, as Jerry's pollster has and mine has for the last 12 years, what proportion of your state taxes do you think are wasted? And when they say 48%, you see the immediate reason, whatever the realities are. It's kind of hard to say 48% when 71% of the state budget is transfers from the state to local agencies, where they generally think there's less waste. Here's an interesting, sorry, it gets me riffing here, if you don't mind. If you compare the states in terms of employees and expenditures on employees, state and local government, my recollection of the numbers are something like this, and I'd have to look it up to be absolutely accurate. Among the 50 states, first of all, we per capita are the fourth thinnest of the 50 states. And mostly that's about economies of scale in an urban environment, but it's interesting that the red states are spending more on government than we are. Secondly, compared to other states, when you add what is the spending, which is what the Republicans asked, not the body count, but if you add in the salaries and the pensions and so on. State government, California state government, I believe on that list is 9th from the bottom. And if you look at local government spending on the list of 50 states, we're 3rd from the top. So one of the ironies is that counts schools and cities and counties and so on. One of the interesting ironies is that level of government about which they have the most, voters have the most confidence and respect, spend substantially more than similar governments in other states. And the state, which they think is wasting money, almost half, is low compared to its spending in other states. So I would hope that there'll be some assessment done of those sorts, but in terms of general tax policy, I wouldn't expect aggregate increases of substantial amounts. Yes, sir.
Bill, you sit on the board of CalSTRS and CalPERS. Can you trace a little bit how the actuarial projections of the funds and the income of the funds, the investment of the funds, and as I understand it, there's a substantial deficit, and maybe project how and the California might deal with that?
Okay. Yes, I'm one who sits on PERS and STRS, and let me mention a little bit about retirement security. There needs to be a national debate to try to figure out what is expected and what's an adequate way to treat retired people. Now, not far from here is a very good friend of mine, Peter Schwartz, who's a futurist, was the forecaster for Shell International for, I think, 13 years, runs a kind of smart think tank, wrote a wonderful book called Inevitable Surprises that discovered black swans 10 years before people found black swans and so on. Peter, I talk to him regularly. What are you thinking about? He says, well, I'm spending a lot of time around the life sciences folks. There's a lot of them in our state, and it's one of our cutting-edge successes. Peter says, anyone currently alive that can live 3 more years will probably live to be 120. And their kids, if they're under 40 or grandkids, there's no upper age. The anti-aging formulas become available at age 40. You stay there as long as you want. My response is, Peter, this is really tough on marriages. I may have to rethink getting into family law as a profession. My second reaction is, this is really difficult on pensions and a whole lot of other things. Well, I had a thought I suppressed because there's a camera running. So assuming that the current actuarial predictions are reasonably reliable, there'll be extended lifespans, but not much more modest than Peter Schwartz would have predicted in that respect. The problems in the public pension systems are mostly grossly exaggerated for ideological reasons. There are people who just don't like public employees. They don't like the public sector. They don't like unions. That's even a stronger. They don't like what unions do with their money, political money. And they frequently don't like what those pension systems do in the ways of demanding improved corporate governance from the companies they invest in, that want boards of directors elected more honestly and not just an inside game and so on. And I think there may be some that think, gee, here are this professional cadre of investors that are working for working people, not rich people. And there's something discomforting about that. So for whatever reason and motivations, we wind up with distorted analysis, most notably the one by my friend, Joe Nation, former Assemblyman Joe Nation, who pumped out this piece of crap for Stanford. And it's just junk. Let me tell you why. I mean, first of all, there's wonderful critiques. If anyone is interested in this subject, and I'm afraid it didn't get circulated in an adequate way, and now everybody sort of regurgitates, the Stanford study without reading the critique, which was a good one in, I think, a woman named Amy Brown, in the Retirement Journal, which critiques the methodology, the assumptions, the fact that it's not a legal form of accounting that they propose, and the list goes on and on. But the more fundamental problem is this. Their claim is that PERS and other pensions should assume, relative to their future return, that it's going to be the same as investing in 10-year federal bonds. That's about 4.1% return. Now, if I have $225 billion and all I'm doing with it is buying U.S. Treasury bonds, I am a fool. I'm leaving potential half or more of my earnings on the table. The facts are, in the last 21 years, the return on PERS investments has been 8.6%. The assumption in their numbers is that it'll grow 7.75%. So they've been beating the assumed rate of return for over 2 decades. Now, we don't know that there'll be similar rates in the future, and so that's a reason to be careful and prudent about those actuarial assumptions, but they aren't far off, and they shouldn't be 4%. And so that's the fundamental problem with the Stanford analysis, and then it balloons the deficit. You can, the earlier the better, you can address the liabilities that are unpaid, and they exist. So first of all, people should know they aren't zero. It's not a system's obligations that have all been paid for. They are 40 years in duration, and you can make small changes in benefit payouts, in retirement ages, in contributions from an employee and employer, and so on, to, over time, balance the system. And that's beginning to happen. The governor had changes made in state employee PERS pensions contributions last year. In some of the negotiated contracts, there are similar changes. There are many of them in local government beginning to work through their system. And so that's addressable in honest ways by competent negotiation. The bigger problem is healthcare. Healthcare is the ballooning cost that's unpaid for. And unlike retirement pensions, where about 72% of the payout is from the investments of the employer and employee contributions that grow, and then that pays for almost 3/4 of the pension obligation, and the employee and employer contribution are about 1/4 combined. Unlike that, healthcare is on pay-as-you-go, and it grows at, you name the number, 7, 9, some big number % a year. So that's what's unpaid for. It's not pre-funded, and it continues to grow, and we continue to get older. And so I don't know to what extent one can claim legitimately that the federal health changes and reform have some impact on the growth. I think about this a lot and talk with people about it a lot, and the fundamental difficulty is essentially the feds control the money and the states control the spending. That is eligibility standards and rates of reimbursement to hospitals and so on. And there's this disconnect. And so when the state tries to save money by controlling the healthcare costs, they don't get much benefit. They're saving money for the feds. But they have to go through the fight about seismic safety standards or nursing staff ratios or whatever the issues, reimbursement for hospitals, the list goes on and on. They have to put up with these horrible political challenges, and there's very little financial benefit for them to do it. In fact, there's a great disincentive because for every buck you cut here, you lose 3 there. And why would we leave the money in Washington, D.C. rather than maximize how much we can draw down? So somebody needs to figure that out. And I think if the Republicans in Congress were smart, rather than health insurance accounts and other IRA mechanisms, which, by the way, are probably the principal reason that Blue Shield has had these huge rate increases that they've insisted on, for their pool of individually covered insurees is that they underpriced the HSA. And so now they've got this HMA. Let's get it right. You know those initials. So the smart thing to do in Washington, I think, would be for them to enact a policy where there's economic incentives built into the system, both federal disbursements and what state behaviors are affected, to save costs. And so you rely on what might be called a market approach, but it's a sort of system market approach to get savings and reforms. Yeah. You know what I forgot to mention while you're thinking about it? The typical state employee, PERS employee, 3/4 of them get a pension of under $30,000 a year. Well, come on. No, I don't think anyone regards that as excessive. What they do worry about, and I think justly, is the spikes, the unfairness, the folks at the top that are making enormous income and huge pensions and figure out how to manipulate the system and game the system to walk away with more. You could tell I was anticipating because I read your column. So, you know, when they're making, you know, essentially $2,500 a month is the average state employee pension. Teachers, it's a couple of times that, but still for a lifetime of work. I don't think most people would regard that as horribly unfair. But we do have abuses in the system, and I think you will see numerous, those of you who have been following the budget debate, any reporter that wants to be well, never mind. You know, I'm sorry, but one of the great disappointments for me is the absence of investigative reporting as I used to see it. And if a reporter wanted to find interesting things in the context of the current debate about redevelopment agencies, hey, you think Bell was bad? Go take a look. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Bill. That's my column for tomorrow, but that's a different...
Oh, okay.
A couple of points that I agree with you on the healthcare issue, that it is the bigger ballooning issue. But on pensions, what is your understanding of the CalPERS assumed rate, or CalPERS rate of return over the past 40 years? My understanding is it's a lot less.
Well, sure, because we had this huge downturn of 24% in 1 year. But it's also this year.
No, over the last 40 years, not 4 years.
Oh, I thought, sorry, you said 4.
40 years. And my understanding is it's a lot less. And so I guess my question to you is, why do you assume that the 20-year horizon to look back is the right one as opposed to the 40-year one? And then more importantly, looking forward, what do you think is a reasonable assumed rate of return? And then I guess the other thing I'd like you to address is the morality, as you see it, of the smoothing in and especially the amortization of the past losses over the next 30 years, essentially pushing the cost of services that have already been provided onto our grandchildren.
I like building schools that the grandchildren will pay for. I think that's a prudent expenditure. And it prudent. Now, wait a minute. I know your philosophy. I read it twice a week.
Okay.
But so, I understand your point. But there are things that we pay for intergenerationally that are smart and wise. And obviously, investing in education is the principal one that makes lots of sense, where the money goes that way. And there are some obligations to older people that go the other way. I guess for those that want to think of it as a banker, say it this way. Businesses amortize their expenditures, their capital outlay. The analogy, it's analogous in the in the human investment sector to doing the same thing and distributing your investment costs over a number of years. That's what a pension is. So it's asking for the same tax treatment that businesses get with their investments. And so I think there's a point to be made about its fundamental fairness in terms of tax philosophy. Now, separate from that, there are abuses. Address the abuses. What should be the correct years that you look at? I don't know. I mean, I think it's a fair debate about which there ought to have. I'm not filled with the conviction that some have, mostly on both sides of the debate, driven by self-interest or philosophy. My friends from public employee unions don't like the rate of assumption being lowered, or when we talk about that. And I'm one that's voted to do it. Whether it's fair to spread losses over a number of years, I think it is. I don't know the right number, but I think that's a fair thing to distribute losses. And among other things, we're obligated under the law to try to maintain a reasonably stable, foreseeable obligation on the part of employers as to what their future contribution will be to the system. And we try to avoid big peaks and valleys that distort their planning and fiscal stability. So there are a variety of factors that feed into the current numbers. It's an active debate, and I think it's an interesting one, and I like the fact that there is now, in both systems for California, a new renewed vigor in looking at those issues, I think, in an honest way. Please.
Yes, change the topic, please.
Sure.
Thank you. My question has to do with the data you presented this afternoon.
Which?
On the screen.
Okay.
Thank you. With Governor Brown's proposal to do a special election on the tax question,
Yeah.
Given the data that you showed here, what arguments would you put forward to the electorate to vote yes?
Well, what there's two phases to the discussion. I think there's the one that the governor started last month, and it made a lot of sense to me, which was to have some public conversations about the extent to which there's a genuine problem. And so I think a lot more of that needs to happen. There's been this nervousness, which is a product largely of political consultants' view of how you conduct a successful campaign, is you can't seem to be threatening voters. If you don't vote for our tax, we're going to get you with the following things. And so there's this worry about the optics associated with that. I understand that. Voters don't want to be threatened. Voters shouldn't be threatened. So I get that. However, you also have to be honest with them about what the consequences might be if the only policy option is an all-cut budget. And no one has yet produced that. I've got one. The Department of Finance, I think, probably has one. There are folks in the legislature thinking of making that public. Mark Leno, the Budget Committee chair, who, by the way, is just extraordinary, is thinking of asking the legislative analyst to produce it. So people can see, what would an all-cut budget look like? Now, I know from looking at that, the hit on K-12 is at least close the schools 6 weeks of the year. Voters need to hear that. They don't want to hear it, but they need to hear that. And one of the great fictions is that 47% of the budget is waste, and somehow you can preserve, as you see in polling data, no cuts in schools, no cuts in health care, no cuts in prisons, and balance the state budget at the same time. That's the fiction. That's the banana republic financing we've done for the last 10 years, and it's got to end. And so let's be honest with voters about what the numbers are and the facts are. Try to do it in a way that is constructive and engaging, and I don't know what the result will be. Now, I admit I've been the minority on the side of this argument since 1979, when my leader, Leo McCarthy, and others said, oh, including the current governor, well, we can't let local services get cut 60%. When they lose 60% of their property tax, the state should bail out local services. I was the one saying, you'll regret it. I think history suggests I was right. Similar argument when the governor, by executive order, eliminated the car tax, and about $7 billion is gone in revenues. We'll bail out the lost revenues because it wasn't state money, it was all local. The state will make up that lost revenues. I was the one that said, you're making a mistake, and I think borne out by the facts. I don't know anyone. Frankly, if you take a poll now, well, people have taken a poll, and it asked, what about these new taxes that were added, the sales tax, the car tax, the PI? They don't know it's there. And so if you ask for a new tax, you're in trouble. If you ask for a continuation of current taxing for a limited time in the context of some serious and genuine reforms and an adequate and honest explanation of the need, I think there's a chance voters vote yes on that. If they don't, you make the cuts. That's what ought to happen. No gimmicks, no borrowing, no phony things. Make the cuts and let people see it and then decide what they prefer. Who do you want?
I'm just a little scared about the fact that Bob Naylor's you're applauding the most.
No, Bob and I frequently should be scared when I agree with Bob a lot more than when he agrees with
First
me.
Bob, and then I know Bob Stern's been up here too, so he'll be next.
Bob squared.
I have a quick follow-up on the PERS STIRS issue. You mentioned healthcare as the big elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Isn't it true that the healthcare obligation to public employees is not as constitutionally protected as the pension?
Yes. You're a lawyer. You
so
know that.
one could, some counties, in fact, have cut the health care benefits for county employees as a way of dealing with their. Okay, that's just.
Yeah, but you're right. The politics are a different question, but
right,
the law
yeah,
is
I
yes.
Okay. Now, I want to explore the potential for insolvency by the state.
Okay.
Let's say the election fails.
Yes.
And let's say the legislature can't bring itself to do the cuts.
Okay.
When do we, I know we will continue to pay the bond debt service, but at some point we will not be able to pay other bills.
Correct.
A la Illinois, which has got this huge billions and billions of dollars of unpaid bills to vendors and others. And
Yeah.
we've deferred an awful lot of payments to local governments and schools and community colleges, just kind of to keep the cash flowing. Give me the doomsday scenario or a plausible scenario if those two things happen.
I'm clicking into the bond salesman mode just for a moment because it's my job, but because I, hear, well, gee, the bond default, and you said it correctly, and you know, Bob, that with respect to paying our debt service, about $86 billion a year comes in this year in general fund revenues. About 40 of that is committed to K-14, so 46 billion is left for other obligations. The first claim is paying of debt service, which is about $5 billion a year. So, and I have a continuous appropriation in law to continue to pay debt service. So assuming there's not a cash flow difficulty, there's no problem in paying a debt service, and the controller and I work closely together to see that there's always cash available to meet those obligations. It would hurt us, the state, a long, deep, fundamental way with respect to business expansion and retention and the optics of our role on the planet and so on if we ever were to default. So that's a thing we need to avoid. So now, having said that, and anyone that owns a California bond should feel okay, let me say there are a lot of more immediate questions, and I'm tempted. I don't know whether to talk about them, but I want to mention three things that come to mind. First of all, we didn't maybe spend enough time on the politics, but it seems to me there is a new niche. Here's what needs to happen. Somehow or another, we have to figure out a way that Republicans running for the legislature aren't committing suicide if they vote for a tax or vote to even let voters vote on the issue. It strikes me as puzzling that the latter isn't okay to do, to let voters decide. And there is some poll data that suggests that that's not hot with Republican voters, but I trust the judgment of people that are closer to their own districts to make that determination. But so somehow in Republican primaries, something has to be done differently, or it won't be too many years from now in which there will be a 2/3 majority of Democrats in both houses of the legislature. That's not good for California. And I know a lot of the folks that I work with that are political allies and friends would be unhappy with my belief that it's better to have bipartisan government if we can. If they're going to continue to be ridiculous and irrelevant, then it's going to happen despite the demographic trends and so on. And shame on them if they let their party, the party of Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, become irrelevant, and Earl Warren and a lot of others. I think there's a niche, by the way, any political consultant, and a new one, for people who will have as their task getting Republicans through in the open primary circumstance to the runoff in Republican districts where there's the right wing and the more moderate Republican, the more traditional Republican, and the business groups should be funding those people. And shame on them, frankly, for not getting engaged in a way that has the Republican Party be that which they would be more comfortable with. So the good news is that Jim Brulte, who happens to be in the room, is the only Republican I know. He's got more brains than all the Republican consultants combined. And fortunately, he's no longer running the campaigns. He could probably figure that out for them. I don't know who else will. But there's a business opportunity and something that's good for the Republic. Now, I went off on that to the point where I'm strayed enough that I've lost it, Bob. So focus me again. Yeah, okay. Well, here's what I'm getting at. There's a couple of other issues that are unresolved. Will the legislature be getting paid in July, or me and others, or not? I think that may have some relevance to the speed of deliberation. And that's something that it can't be answered yet. Now, there is a way under Prop 25 in which you can enact a budget and you've done your job and you continue to get paid, but there isn't a budget in place. It's been vetoed, it's unworkable, whatever. And I think for leaders in the legislature, I'm one of those that know. This is like retailing, where in September you're trying to figure out what is the spring color going to be. And you catch a wave if you've guessed right with respect to your proposal. So for Darrell Steinberg, it's realignment. I think he's caught a wave. There's a lot of interest from the governor and others, and some active work going on to try to make that work and match, as I was talking about with federal health expenditures, in this instance, match money and program responsibility and accountability. Good principle. And he's trying to figure that out, and the governor and others. So that may be a wave. For a legislative leader, the last week of the session is when you can really get things done. They're busy. They're desperate for their bills. Their babies are scattered around. They're trying to protect and defend. And the nitpicky factor really vanishes, so you can actually be bold and get something done. Leaders ought to want between, what's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in June? Anyone know the date yet? 7th? So between June 8th and July 1st, legislative leaders ought to have every tool available at their disposal to make very hard decisions, and one of them would be, oh, we're not going to get paid in 3 weeks. So there's some things like that, and some people that would like to avoid that dilemma by what they would do this spring and so on. So it's hard to answer the question, and we don't know yet if, for example, you make budget cuts now, which I think they ought to do. I would go and make a whole lot of budget cuts right now so voters can see that you're doing it and it's genuine. You know you're going to have to make them in the context of the March budget, the June budget, or the July budget. You're going to have to make them. Get them done, the sooner the better. You start saving some money and it becomes a shallower hill to fill, the hole to fill if you make cuts early. What happens? You just start deferring everything. It's a mess. You pay bills with IOUs. One of the problems that we have right now, and I don't know how this fits into the electoral calculus, depending on whether or not cuts can be made soon, IOUs may have to go out in May. I don't even want to think about that, but we have to. It's part of our job, and it has some results on the people's perception of the ability to solve problems in Sacramento and how they might vote, and it's just a mess. So I think the argument. I don't know the answer other than you defer everything as much as you can. There are a lot of constraints on what you can and can't defer. There's some federal law. There's very state-protected continuous appropriations. It is a giant mess. And the all-cut budget is so awful. I honestly don't know how any legislator can legitimately want to do that. It makes no sense to me. No matter how much they think they ought to shrink government, the only reason there'll be some that want to vote for it is either they're like my guy when I asked what percent of the state budget is waste, and he said 98%. God, I wanted to ask him, what's the 2? I mean, they may just be so radically don't have any services that they're willing to not have public schools and things that are just really radical ideas. Or the politics scare them so much of the future primary. And this is a function of term limits, by the way. In a pre-term limit world, there would have been some Republicans that said, it's my public duty to vote for these things even though I don't like them. And in the era of term limits, when you're faced with a new district that's going to be larger because you may run for the Senate, or add to that reapportionment, the only leavening or ameliorating factor is the open primary and what the potential is for the moderate Republican to prevail in a Republican district against a more conservative Republican in a one-on-one. Sorry, long answer to, and I yes.
Do we have time? Bob Stern next
Oh, yeah,
year.
sorry, Bob. It's Bob Stern. Go ahead, we can hear you.
Thanks, Bill. Bill, you've had a very successful career in public service. Can you name us your biggest accomplishment and your biggest regret?
I looked at you have to first of all say legislative things, executive things. The jobs are so different in the two branches. Frankly, it's 10 times harder being responsible for managing something than just having an opinion. We elect them to have an opinion, and okay. In the legislative branch, and it would be good if they got a little more engaged in the duties of oversight and management, and I think that would be a constructive thing, and have recommended regularly go out and look at the things you're trying to manage and fund and so on. On the legislative side, it's a simple one, but what I would say, and there's a long list, and my staff put together this book for me one time, and frankly, I was impressed. I think I must have gotten credit for a lot of other people's ideas that I put my name on or something, but anyhow, Bay Trail. 25 years ago, I suggested, why don't we have a trail around the entire bay, several hundred miles of trail that is near the bay, and link all of these little pieces here and there of things. And in terms of something tangible that I care about, you might say protective services for seniors, or there's a whole list of programmatic things and some laws, tort reform that no one had ever done but me, and a lot of things. But that one, it's the Bay Trail. In the executive office, here's what I try to do. Wherever I am, I try to figure out a way to make the system better, to make the program or the place work better. And, I did things in the legislature that were really designed as the president of the Senate to have a fair compensation system for employees. It doesn't last very long when you do that, frankly, because it's so politicized. But and a system of plop the computer on everyone's desk so they can actually look at the bill that's being discussed or whatever. Just things that try to make it a better process, and a number of other ways. In AG land, there's 20 of these, but just to give you one example that makes me proud. So I get there and I find we've been collecting DNA samples from convicted felons for 12 years. There's 250,000 of them in the refrigerator. They haven't been digitized. And as a result, they're catching almost one guy a year using DNA. So we did a crash program, not much money. Frankly, it wasn't a budget thing. It was more management and motivation of state employees who wanted some active management, and they hadn't had it for a long time, to get those digitized, and we did. And when I left, I think we were catching cold hits, instead of one a year, 20 a day. Now, these are crimes against women and children that were going unpunished. And it's a good thing. And there's 20 of those there. And similarly, in where I am now, there's a lot of things that, aren't thrilling, no one writes about. Tens of $8.5 billion a day comes through my shop. A lot of it is paper. It's now electronic. And the savings and the efficiencies that accrue when you go paperless and do things electronically with your banking systems like we have are enormous. So it's kind of what I do, is just try to make things work better. And I think that's what we need to do in response to the various questions about program spending and tax levels and so on. We have to figure out how to demonstrate, and probably can't demonstrate without doing it, that people are getting a buck's worth of service for every dollar's worth of tax, and that we're doing the best we possibly can to be efficient about public expenditures. So I think I've run out of time, but
One more question.
Oh, disappointment. It's all personal. It's all, losing my temper and being unnecessarily aggressive or angry to get my way. It was a gimmick, frankly. It was a way I intimidated people. It worked. I don't feel good about that. And you know, what I've learned, frankly, is being civil, treating people respectfully is a better way to govern, and particularly with your colleagues and peers. And so whenever I slipped, you know, because I had some muscle and could do it, that's what I probably regret more than anything else. You said one more?
One more small question.
Sure, a small question.
Small. Because you can't get bigger than big regrets and big wins. Okay.
Where's the location of the Shalom Meyer Tower? Oh, that was my question? Oh, he asked it, not me? Oh, okay.
I have a different
Sorry,
question.
What was the question?
I have a different question. You mentioned May and you mentioned May and IOUs.
Yeah.
What's the scenario in which the state has to begin issuing IOUs in May?
If it's unable to meet the self-imposed deadlines by the governor and the legislature to adopt a budget in a timely way that addresses the current very substantial shortfall in current accounts, we will run out of money to pay the bills either in this fiscal year or shortly in the next fiscal year, that the controller will have to begin to conserve cash to pay bills in the summer and potentially issue IOUs in April or May. I am not supposed to say any of this, so I didn't say it. And I deny it if anyone quotes me.
And no one in this room would quote you, I'm sure.
And I always appreciate knowing and working and talking with you. My work, frankly, is improved by your interaction and thoughts and your friendships. And I've enjoyed doing it. Thanks very much.